Hi everyone. My name is Skylar or Sky. I am a member of SVS. I went through the mentorship program and I am currently the host of Founder Friendly, which is our podcast. And with us today is Andrea Chesleigh. So thank you so much for joining us, Andrea.
Thanks for having me. So excited to be here.
So for any of you who don't know, Andrea is currently VP of Product at Boxed and is the lead of Women in Product in the NYC chapter. So she has led teams at One Kings Lane, Rent the Runway, Zappos, and Verizon, among a list of other companies. So of course, Andrea, you can give a much more thorough introduction. So please, if I've missed anything, feel free to share.
No, you got it. So I've spent about 15 years in product and primarily in e-commerce. And as you mentioned, Sky, both at startups and Fortune 500 companies. So I've run the gamut of experiences in large companies and small companies and what that's like.
Yeah, so you have a lot of wisdom to impart on us today. So I guess just to start off for people who may not be totally familiar, I mean, product management, product managers, that term is thrown around a lot. And I think it's a bit intuitive. There's a general understanding. But can you tell us a little bit about what the day-to-day looks like for someone in PM?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. So, I mean, let's start with what inherently product does, right? So inherently, we're problem solvers. We sit at this intersection of the customer, engineering, user experience, and the business. And so we think about how to solve customer pain points, and our decisions really revolve around the questions, is it good for the customer? Is it good for the business? And a little bit of, is it good for the world? So the day-to-day is not as sexy as that, of course, because there is a lot of getting the work done and shipping the product and working with your cross-functional team partners. But ultimately, it is about problem solving together.
So much of it is problem solving. And we've spoken a bit about this and how there is an approach that kind of applies to all projects, no matter what the product may be. So can you speak a little bit about what that is, what that foundational core values that you look for and use when approaching projects?
Yeah. So there is this very, very sort of classic question that you tend to ask as a PM, and it's really about what is the problem you're trying to solve? So is it the right problem? Is it right to solve it now? But ultimately, that's the key thing, followed by who are you solving it for and how do you define success? So what you need to really make sure is that these are the key things that you're able to answer to make sure that what you're doing actually makes sense. And this takes many forms. Marty Kagan, who's really sort of the grandfather of product, here at the seminal book, Inspired. If you're interested in product, you should definitely read that book. He calls it an opportunity assessment. For my team, we do what's called a one-pager template that really addresses the questions that I talked about, but also a little bit more. So things like, what does the competitive landscape look like? And digging a little bit into that, who's doing it well, who's not doing it so well, and what can we learn from it? So really having this sort of critical eye or critical view of how to solve the problem.
And breaking it down into its most simple.
Yes.
Okay.
Ultimately, as you think about the solution, depending on the life cycle of the solution that you're thinking, you might have a hypothesis that you want to try and test out, right? And so a lot of times you might decide to approach things in this iterative fashion, and your first foray into the solution is what we call an MVP, or minimum viable product, where you're just really thinking about, okay, these are my hunches. How do I test my way into it? How do I prove it and get maximum learnings with the least amount of effort? And then once you've proven that, then you might want to iterate and make the product better and better.
So that being said, what do you think kind of differentiates someone from being a good VC, not VC, PM, and being a great PM? And what are the values and principles that they use that embody that?
Yeah. I think about it in sort of three competencies, and there's a lot that goes into this, but the first is strategy. So you have to be a bit of a dreamer. So the ability to think big, having this sort of vision of what the solution could be, and not just, improving the customer's life a little bit better, but how do you make it hugely better, 10x, 100x better, right? So having that vision and then being able to break it down and balance the short term versus the long term. So for example, if you're focusing on growth, you don't want to just say, okay, I'm going to focus and try to get customers to come in. You also want to have a long-term vision of, are these customers going to be served so that they will want to stay long-term? The other bucket is empathy, because I think ultimately, if you don't have that customer focus and the ability to put yourself in the customer's shoes, then any solution that you think about is just not going to work. So having that customer focus, looking at data, whether it's qualitative and talking to customers or quantitative, and then really trying to derive from there the customer pain points, as well as part of empathy, this ability to build relationships, not just with a customer and having that dialogue, but also with your cross-functional partners. Because ultimately being a PM means being the hub, and there's a lot of leading by influence. There's a lot of collaborative work that has to happen. So empathy is crucial. And then the last, right? So we talked about strategy, we talked about empathy. The last thing is grit. So you can't be a dreamer without doing. You've got to do the work. This is the not so sexy, but you just have to get stuff done, execute the hell out of your strategy, and being able to learn from failure and just willing to try again, even if you fail. So ultimately being able to be humble, do your best, look at your failures, look at your learnings and say, what can I get from it? And really try to leverage those failures into nuggets of learning so that you can do better. So those are the three things I would say: strategy, empathy, and grit.
So that's how a PM can really stand out. And how do you think those things materialize very concretely when you're working in a team?
I mean, I think you will be able to see that because the PM, at least as I would define it, maybe I'm a little bit biased because I come from a product background, but the PM is the de facto leader in many ways, right, of a squad. And so I think being able to motivate and work well together, you see the outcome. So it's not about the PM necessarily, but the outcome that you're able to bring, the value that you're able to bring to the customer, the happiness of the team, the impact of the business. I think these are the things that become tangible to see whether the PM is effective or not.
Okay, thank you. And so you definitely mentioned sometimes PMs take an iterative approach. They have to be vision oriented. So all of these characteristics definitely remind us a lot of founders, and we've spoken a lot about how PMs have founder aspirations. So do you want to speak more about this mindset and why you think it's so valuable?
Yes, I think there is a very sort of natural progression for a product manager to then want to do their own thing. The role of a product manager is inherently very cross-functional. So that really means you dabble in many things, especially in a startup. You wear many hats, you play different roles, and that really gives you exposure to various functional lanes, which then allows you to be prepared to then take on that founder role because you've had sort of that exposure of thinking about maybe partnering with marketing, engineering, in my case, because it's e-commerce, maybe merchandising, financials, et cetera, et cetera. So what tends to happen is that PMs develop this very strong entrepreneurial spirit, even in the very beginnings of their career, because your approach to your product is like your approach to a company, right? It's really about when you're ready to take that step, it's scaling that vision and your approach into a broader or bigger picture. It leads to problem solving and product development through founding a company.
Definitely. And we actually have a question from Vanessa, who's curious about if you've ever executed a product where everyone in your team wasn't necessarily on board in the beginning, and how did you kind of get their buy-in?
I mean, this is going to be sort of the ups and downs of a product manager, product leader. Not everything is going to be 100% everybody's on board, right? That's definitely just the reality. And I think ultimately one of the key things that a product manager has to be able to do is, again, as I talked about, lead by influence. And so being able to communicate that vision. Why is it important to solve this problem? Why is it important for our customers? How are you backing this up? Why is it important to the business? What is the role that your teammates play? And so that you create this shared mission, if you will, that will allow people to feel vested in the problem that you're solving together. And I'm not saying that that is always going to work, but I think it's the product manager's role to be able to articulate clearly why it's important to work on this problem now.
Yeah, and to follow up on that with the mission aspect, of course, some companies very clearly have a mission, and others it might be more nuanced. How does that influence your approach to problem solving for a particular company?
I think for me, I think the reason I stayed in a particular area, which is e-commerce, B2C, right, for the consumer, I like humanizing the problem. I like knowing who I'm solving it for, because ultimately we're all humans, and it's something that we can all relate to. For example, one of the things that I love about the problems we solve at Boxed is that everybody needs household essentials. Everybody needs to purchase these things, right? It's not so much as, oh, I want this. A lot of it is you need. It's sort of satisfying these hierarchy of needs. And so ultimately, if I think of the problem as with a human eye and a human approach, and being able to communicate that with a team, I think that makes it more real, right? The stakes are higher for people because you can relate to it.
Yeah, and that was actually falling into my next question a bit. So you specialize in e-commerce consumer products, and you kind of touched on what excites you so much about that space. But what do you think are the benefits of specializing in an industry versus being more of a generalist PM?
I think it depends on how you think about your career. It depends on what you're passionate about, and it depends on your learning appetite. Meaning, are you more of a breadth person versus depth person? For me, I started my career in e-commerce and consumer services, and I just fell in love with building products and solving problems for the individual, for the consumer. And that's why I stayed, because I felt like there was so much to learn. And again, even when you stay if you specialize in, let's say, a particular vertical or industry, there's still so many nuances. There's still so much to really learn that it doesn't really, I don't feel pigeonholed, but I think it really depends on how you view your career and what your I don't want to say end game, but let's say that, right? But what is your end game? I would ultimately love to be a founder in a consumer space, building products for women, because I'm a community builder for women as well. And so this is something that leverages my experience. So again, depends on how you view your career path and what your dreams are.
Yeah, well, we look forward to when you found that company. And just, I have a question from Lily, who wants to know, what was your first product role, and what was that like, and what did you learn, just along the same vein of learning from consumer product roles?
That's such a great question. We'll go back in time a little bit. My first product role was at a big company. It was Verizon. And at that time, it was all about consumer broadband. So it was, Fios TV. If you think about the services that Verizon sells, it really is about that, broadband and entertainment. And that is not an easy thing to try to sell online. And on top of that, it's a utility. So there's a lot of emotion, whether you love a company as a consumer or you hate a company as a consumer. I think there's just so much that goes into it. And so I definitely approached it more as, again, with sort of guidance. I was very lucky that I was taken under the wing of this wonderful, wonderful group product manager who saw, I guess, some potential. And so I think trying to think about how do you guide the customer, because again, everything that you either sell or anything that you're trying to put in front of a customer, the mindset is going to be different, right? So trying to provide them household essentials versus utility services versus fashion, that mindset is going to be different. So think about how is the best way for me to be able to help you learn and figure out what is right for you, whether, you need HBO or not. And so it was really about that guided learning and selling to the customer. And so that was like one key takeaway for me, is that one size does not fit all. And you learn that early in your career. I think that was super foundational for me, because then I didn't try to apply that when I moved over to Zappos. When you're trying to buy shoes, it's not the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. And you spoke a little bit about having a mentor or having some guidance in your earlier team. And you are obviously the lead of Women in Product in NYC chapter, and we've spoken a little bit about how, you're this powerhouse PM, but as a woman, you become a powerhouse female PM, and we kind of qualify women in that way. And I'm just, how do you feel? Because obviously, that we do that qualification, be it in business, tech, or other, because we want to celebrate women and their accomplishments in industries that are largely male dominated. So, if you want to touch on that a bit.
Yeah, so many thoughts. I think this is such a great question. I mean, listen, ultimately, I would love to live in a world where I'm simply a leader, not a female leader, right? And the work that we do in Women in Product, and I actually, I co-lead a chapter with two other wonderful, wonderful product leaders. And so the work that we do is about getting to that world where you're a leader, and that's the end of it. But until we get there, it's about representation. It's about widening the pool. It's about making connections and helping you open doors. It's about equal pay, and it's about what's fair. So until we get there, I think there's still a lot of room for this kind of work that we do. So I was at a Chief event last night. I know. We talked a little bit about Chief, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Chief event, a virtual event last night, where Gloria Steinem was the speaker, and she really said it best, right? That the way she sees it is that there is no gender. We're all humans. So that's where that's really what I strive to do. I want to get to a point where we are the best version of ourselves and not be qualified as a female PM, a female engineer, a female CEO. But until we see that, we're going to have to continue to keep doing the work that we're doing to push that forward.
Yeah, and if you can talk a little bit more about your work in Chief and your role there.
So I was very lucky. I mean, that I was able to join Chief in its early stages. And I think Chief does such a wonderful job creating this network for women at the higher levels of their career, right? So if we think about just sort of, when I talk about creating networks or creating a tribe or having opportunities, I think we need to make sure we have that at every single level, because representation actually becomes more crucial the higher you get. Learning is important no matter what stage you are in your career. But more importantly, as I was saying, representation becomes more crucial because it is so much harder to get into those executive roles. There are fewer. And so, I mean, let's be realistic. We all need that. And so I need that too. And so I think seeing an organization like Chief has been super helpful because of the work that they do, where I have a place also to be able to reach out and have those same opportunities and have those same doors help open for me. And so it's been extremely gratifying just to be part of that group.
Sorry. Thank you for everything that, you know, you're doing to kind of mentor and uplift and open these doors for women in product. And as you mentioned, that sort of diversity and representation in leadership positions is also important, I'm sure, in your experience working on a team for product to really understand the consumer and the different consumers that you have. So have you ever had an experience working on a team that you were able to realize and value how important it was to have a very diverse, you know, representative group of people?
I mean, I think that's the value of product right there, right? We're all very different, and I think representation, not even just as a woman, but like as a woman of color, I think that all plays into it. We're all consumers. We're all humans. So, as an example, I mean, even at Boxed or at One Kings Lane, I mean, we're all sort of trying to figure out not just one archetype. So one of the things that we think about in product is that there is no just, you know, I talked about like building for the individual, but there is no just one. We're not all alike. And so there might be, for example, at Boxed, a younger male who's purchasing, a mom, or, you know, a couple. I think it really sort of like runs that gamut. And so I think diversity within the team also gives you that diversity of thought and diversity of points of view that you're going to need to be able to really solve problems holistically.
Yeah, definitely. And now just turning back to, I guess, opening up for some more questions from our audience. We have a question from Grace, who's asking if you have ever launched a product that didn't go as well as you thought it would. And if so, how did you and your team respond?
Oh, yes. Yes. So I remember at Rent the Runway, we were launching, and this was in its earlier days, we were launching this style quiz. And I was so excited about it because we actually had a team. It was like sort of an onboarding shorts project, if you will, with our new hires. And the idea was just to build an MVP for a problem we were trying to solve. And in this case, we were trying to solve the idea of data collection around customer styles and customer preferences. So we thought, okay, we will be able to then test out a style quiz. I mean, at that time, it was like the thing to do. And I think for me, in hindsight, I was so focused on delivering the best version of that product, which is fine, right? Like, I think we all aspire to build the best products that we can, that I forgot the sort of the capabilities of the team. And so there's one thing to sort of push your team, but then it's another thing to set them up for failure. And I think I was so excited about the prospect of building something that was this wonderful tech forward solution that I really hampered the team. And so it took us a long time to build this MVP. I mean, it's an MVP that our CTO at that time finally said to me, Andrea, you just have to launch it. Just launch it. A 4-week project became an 8-week project, became a 12-week project. And it launched. It didn't do as well because honestly, it was the first version and we should have just tested a very lightweight version. And for me, the learning wasn't even there. It wasn't even that, right? The learning for me was I felt like I let my team down because they should have been feeling excited about the feature. They should have been feeling successful about what they have accomplished. But instead, we took this very long, drawn out approach. And then ultimately, the learnings, while valuable, were not as exciting for them.
So how do you, from that experience and taking what you learned there, then go forward and straddle this, we want to create a really strong product, but also we can't, be too honed down in being perfectionists if it is just like the first version or the MVP. So how do you kind of like, balance that?
Yeah. I think this is something where PMs definitely struggle, because you're either going to be very ruthless about the product and it's kind of like a terrible product, but you're just sort of like, okay, doesn't matter, we'll learn something, or you become so obsessed and that it just is overly bloated. So I think the balance is really making sure you are aligned on the questions you want to answer in this first version. And I think you have to circle back to that. And that's why this one-pager process and mapping out what problem exactly you're trying to solve and the questions you're trying to answer and what that success looks like for this version is going to be super critical. And spending the time to plan that is actually not wasted, because that's what's going to keep you honest. And then that document is something that you share with the team. And so you guys are all kept honest, especially if you have a PM at that time. It was definitely me who leads you astray and says, okay, no, but we can make it better and better and better, but not in a productive way, right? So spending the time to really make sure you're answering the questions for that version is going to be critical.
So we have a follow-up, or not a follow-up question, but a question that I think applies to this from Daniel. How are you working with engineers, data scientists, designers, and SME in a given sprint? And I also think in that vein, what you just said, when do you ask your team to kind of push back at you in maybe some of what you're telling them to do?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So we work in what we call a squad structure, which is a fairly common structure for startups, tech companies, et cetera. And so it's a team that's made up of cross-functional members. You have your PM, you have your designer, you have your engineers, data science, QA, et cetera. And you have obviously your stakeholders. You work together by solving problems together. And the way to do that is creating these squads that are goal oriented. You are aligning on goals and outcomes, as opposed to like, here's a backlog, go do it. Because then you're able to think about the problems together, depending on how small or big the solution is. You might decide to have either a pre-brainstorm or just talking about what the solution could look like, getting the engineer's point of view, getting the designer's point of view. So I think it's very much that collaborative like team environment that allows you to be successful. And so we really try to make sure that the squads are gold on that. And we set up what we call OKRs, right? Your objectives and key results. So again, you're outcome focused and you're thinking about how to get to those outcomes together. And you're bringing them early on in the journey, as opposed to just handing them the work, because you don't create accountability and you don't create teamwork that way. You want to do it together so that everybody feels vested in that mission.
And that collaborative nature allows them to voice any concerns or opinions.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And then it becomes there might be some negotiation or trade-offs, but people feel heard. Now, obviously, when there's sort of this impasse, there has to be a decision that's made, and ultimately that still falls on the PM. But I think being part of a team means that your voice is heard. And so that is what we try to make sure we foster.
Right. Yeah. And another question from Daniel that I think is really great is, do you have a North Star metric in your time at Boxed or any company really? And how do you choose other supporting / complementing metrics for a feature of a product domain?
I mean, when you're really thinking about North Star, dreamy KPI, right? I mean, for e-commerce, people would probably say, oh, it's conversion, but it's not, because ultimately that's such a transactional metric, and that doesn't really, it gives me a very linear view of how a customer relates to us. It's very much, I come in, I purchase, I leave. Okay, that's great. To me, the North Star is really just, it's about customer happiness. And I realize that sounds super floofy, but it isn't, right? Because customer happiness will allow that customer to not just transact with you once, they'll come back. They'll become an advocate. They'll be a super fan. They'll go on social and talk about you and convince their family and their friends, et cetera. So when I think of North Star metrics, I really think about that just sort of very dreamy, very aiming high, mission-driven type of metric. Then yes, then you'll have your complementary metrics like how a customer behaves on the site, and that tends to be very much like the conversion metric, or what that shopping funnel looks like and how they proceed within the steps of the shopping experience. So those are sort of the things that you can absolutely quantify, but ultimately it's customer happiness, right?
And you touched a little bit about how you might be able to quantify customer happiness, but how else might you do that?
I mean, so there's that. It's how often do they return? Do they come back? Again, I think it's various pieces, and it depends on your industry. I'm very, very much talking about e-commerce. So it really is that relationship that we build with them. And it's that cycle of you come in, you continue to engage with us in some fashion, whether it's you're visiting the site often, you engage with our emails, do you come back and make your repeat purchases? And then there's a little bit of like that next layer of loyalty, and how does that sort of play? Whether, again, it's the repeat behavior, but then there's also the super fan piece of this. And we used to do this a lot at Zappos as an example, where our VIPs, and there was this VIP program, and that's how we thought of it. Are you a super fan? And how do you talk about Zappos? And so that to me is sort of the whole life cycle of it, because it is more of a cycle as opposed to just this linear thing. You know, you're not building a relationship if it's one and done. It really is about just creating this sort of feedback loop so that they keep coming back and then ultimately become your greatest advocates.
And I'm curious if you having this insight and being a PM at so many different e-commerce companies are able to maybe look at some companies that you haven't, worked for or know directly, but you can see whether they place that importance on their customer or on another more quantitative metric.
I mean, you definitely see some of that stuff, and I'm trying to think a little bit, who is sort of in my mind is the one that makes you feel super special. I mean, Zappos was one. I mean, I realize I'm a little bit unbiased again because I worked for them, but that is where I really built my foundation on just customer happiness, because it wasn't about these very transactional KPIs, right? Like if you're in customer service, it didn't matter how long it took for you to solve a customer problem. The metric was, did you leave that customer happy? And so I take that to the rest of my journey after Zappos, and I'm finding, I mean, we have a very similar approach at Boxed, and where it really is about customer delight. And it's not just sort of that journey when you get to the site, but I don't know if you've ever ordered from Boxed, but the things that I take away is actually post that purchase, where you get a little selfie of your order. And I mean, pre-pandemic, you would get little notes in your box. And I think these are the things that, again, it's that human connection that makes that experience special. So again, sorry for being for being a little bit biased, but I mean, I feel like these are very special companies.
They definitely are, and I definitely think that they're only improved after having your touch. But you mentioned this a bit, how the pandemic has influenced some of the packaging at Boxed. How else? A question from James is, how has the pandemic impacted the products mix offered by Boxed, and how has the company changed to cater to the demand of consumers during COVID in particular?
I mean, I think, I'm gonna pull back a little bit on that answer, right? Because I mean, we all know what we were shopping for during this time, right? We're all worried about the toilet paper, the paper towels, the wipes, et cetera. But ultimately, I think, again, as we think about problems that we're solving as product managers, it's what are the core values that I want you to feel during this time? we're all anxious, we're all a little bit worried, we're all a little bit afraid. And so if Boxed can play a little bit of a role to help you feel a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more secure, regardless of what you purchase. But again, it's going to be those household essentials, right? Make no mistake. But for us, it's really about how can we make you feel during this time? Because that is the role of product managers, less so about the merchandise, right? Because that's what our merchandising team does an excellent job of. For us, it's what do we want you to take away from the experience as you're going through it?
And another question from Kenny is, how does the role of a PM differ between various firms? So the difference between being a PM at a Fortune 500 company or a smaller startup?
I think it's a few things. One, at a smaller startup, you do get a chance to roll up your sleeves and dabble in various things. So again, partnering very, very closely with your cross-functional partners. I do think that there's a lot of not just strategy work, but also doing, because your teams are probably going to be smaller, and probably there's going to be not that there's no urgency in a larger company, but I think there is a particular type of urgency and fire that happens at a startup that can be super energizing, that you won't necessarily get from a larger company. And again, that's a fairly general statement, so I don't want to say that that's going to be the same across the board. What you do get from a large company is, I think, not the luxury, I would say, but the ability to plan a little bit more long-term, a little bit more, maybe 3 to 5 to 10 years down the line. And so there is a little bit more of that far-reaching vision that a larger company will just give you that capability.
Yeah.
So it really depends on what you want to get out of your PM experience. I highly recommend, though, trying large companies, small companies, various stages of startups, so that you can understand yourself what those nuances are.
Yeah, I remember speaking to you a bit about how do you choose, what stage of a company you want to join. So definitely just trying out all of the different options. So now, I guess shifting a bit into some questions we have regarding recruiting and how us students can get involved in PM. We have a question from Amanda, who asks, how would you recommend someone who doesn't have a lot of PM technical experience get into the field?
That's a great question. I think that this is a lot. I think it's two pieces that I'd like to address. One is the getting your foot in the door for product, which I think is one piece. And I think very tactically, you'll probably have an easier time thinking about perhaps a startup rather than a larger company. So that's one, right? Because just sort of like risk tolerance of an entry-level role. Also, it might be before you get into a product manager role. If you think about the product career ladder, some companies tend to have the first rung of the ladder, if you will, as sort of the product analyst role. So think about just sort of not necessarily just, okay, well, I'm going to jump in and try to get a product manager role right away. There could be sort of the build up, getting your foot through the door, or adjacent roles, whether it's an analyst role or, again, not necessarily within product, but even as in analytics, et cetera. That definitely helps, right? Because the road to product is not, there's no one way to do that. And then in terms of the technical piece, I do think that there's going to be less and less of that, because I think, when I first started, it was very much, well, you're either a technical PM or you're not, and you need to have a computer science degree in order for you to get a PM role at a tech company. But I think ultimately you need to be technical to understand the trade-offs, to have an intelligent conversation with your engineer, but you are not going to be the one building that solution, right? So understand the level of what technical means for you and that company. So that's one. I think that's an easy enough area to really bone up on. And then making sure that you're really thinking about critical thinking, solving problems, because that's what's important, as opposed to just saying, oh, I come from a computer science background, right? I think especially in New York, you're going to see that less and less.
And you've spoken a lot about characteristics of what make a good PM, and what are the characteristics you think that we can develop currently, in university or through our extracurriculars that will help us stand out once we get these internships?
That's a great question. So I think that going back to how I said, ultimately a product manager will probably then get into sort of like some sort of founder role, and think about what you would need as a founder, right? Like, sure, you'll need all the operator experience, but if you think about having customer empathy and thinking about how you put yourself in the customer's shoes. So whether it's some sort of classes in human-centered design, there's gonna be those type of skills. Then there's going to be the business aspect, or sort of the finance aspect, and then there's going to be the technical aspect. So the way that I think about product is really just sort of more of a liberal arts or humanities background, in the sense that it is all encompassing. So there's not going to be one class that you're going to take that's going to prepare you, but I think it's a mindset of knowing that you're going to be using all of these different skills to get into product. But you need to then think about what we just said in terms of what makes a great product manager, whether it's strategic thinking. And so how do you cultivate that? It is customer empathy, and how do you exercise that muscle and looking at a particular design or solution, and then the ability to execute. I mean, that's just pure grit. And if you're working really hard, I think as a student, you'll carry that hopefully into the rest of your life.
Thank you. It's comforting to hear that it is a very holistic area and set of skill sets. And I guess another question in this area is Eric, who asks, when you're hiring candidates, what are some of the top traits you look for in their application? So he's touched on this a bit, but I'm not sure if there's anything specific.
I mean, I think it's primarily, so, I mean, you look at a resume and ultimately like that for me, that just starts a conversation, right? I still look for how you think, how do you interact with the team? I mean, really how you think. And so how I definitely try to tease that out is I'm a big fan of case studies. And so you come in, I've been told sometimes that this is a bit of a, it can be rough, because I will want you to have a particular case study that you would then present to the team. Because for me, it gives me an idea of a few things. One, how you think about a problem. I care less about the polished nature of if you're going to give me an actual digital product. It's how you get there and how you talk about it, how you interact with my team, because you're doing a presentation. So they're going to be asking you questions. Are you defensive? Are you answering it clearly? How are you interacting with them? And so the case study is a very, very critical portion for me of that process. And so that's how I'm able to to find what I'm looking for, because a lot of it is intangible until I interact with you, right? It's the critical thinking. How do you get to solution? Your relationship building, your empathy, and that means how you're interacting with your potential teammates. And really, again, not so much as the time you've put into the case study, but just your thoughtfulness about it. So it does tend to be intangible. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a wonderful, intimidating, but fun exercise. And that also answers a bit of our next question from Joe. What are some resources that students can use to read about PM or practice some of the essential skills? So would you say any practice with case studies or?
So there's a couple of books that I'm a big fan of. I think I mentioned one already. I think just the basics of what a PM is compared to other roles, right? So Inspired by Marty Kagan. The other book is Cracking the PM Interview, because it is just such a wealth of it's just such a great resource, giving you sort of a view of various companies, what they look for. I mean, the non-technical PM that comes up all the time, right? And so they definitely do a great job of tackling that. And then depending on, the depth of learning that you're trying to do, I mean, Medium articles, Substack newsletters, there's a lot of resources out there. One in particular that I'm a huge fan of is Lenny's newsletter. Lenny, I'm blanking on how to pronounce his last name, which is terrible because he is so great. And so he basically he was a former product lead at Airbnb, and he puts out this wonderful newsletter. And he just sort of breaks down, Lenny Rachitsky. So he breaks down a lot of product concepts. So you can be a seasoned product manager or trying to break into product. Like, that's one of my favorite resources too. So, but I follow a lot of these people on Twitter. So if you guys follow me on Twitter, you're going to see who I follow. So you'll be able to, and you can DM me, and I'm happy to provide more information. So I'm Andrea Chesleigh at Twitter.
Awesome. We will give you a follow. I'm going to leave a few more minutes. If there are any other questions, people can post in the chat, but we are nearing the end of our time, unfortunately. I guess while we're waiting, I'll ask you, Andrea, if there's anything, we do this on Founder Friendly, our podcast, if there's anything you want to plug or any shout outs you want to give, feel free to do so.
Shout out to you guys. This is fantastic. When definitely I was getting into product, there were just not a lot of resources, right? And then I love that you're taking it next level and really thinking about what that landscape of being a founder looks like. So shout out to you guys. Thank you so much for having me. And like I said, if you guys have any other questions, I'm definitely always available. Twitter's the best way to reach me. So, I would say that's my only plug.
Great. And we do have one more question from Julia. How did you know you were interested in product management, and what were the specific experiences that pushed you in that direction?
So there is no linear journey into product, right? When I was getting into product, I didn't even know what it was. Now you have wonderful resources like Product School. General Assembly does a lot of like product curriculum. At that time, when I was in college, I started as a computer science major, but I also had a lot of other interests. I paint, I write. I was very, very much interested in the classics, and literature. So it was just sort of like one of those things where I was having this crisis of what do I really want to major in? And so ultimately I ended up with a creative writing and painting dual degree. And then going out into my career, it was really, I stumbled upon it. So I started out in analytics. I was an analyst. And what happened there was, as I was saying, I was taken under her wing, this group product manager. And ultimately what she said to me was, you seem to be creative. You seem to like solving problems. You seem to just have a pretty good way of looking at a problem critically. I think you should try this thing called product. And that's how I stumbled upon it. So, and I've loved it ever since because it does allow you to do a little bit of everything. So I would say if you enjoy solving problems, if you enjoy learning constantly, if you enjoy doing all of the, doing a lot of grunt work, the unsexy work, but ultimately the payoff is huge because you're solving a problem, you're building for somebody, and you might want to try a career in product, right? It's not going to be boring. That's all I could say.
Definitely not. You've had a really wonderful career, and we are looking forward to when you start your own company. So that all sounds really wonderful. I guess my final question is, given I also have a bit of a, both artistic and business techie interests, how do you suggest finding those mentors in PM that kind of help guide you in the way that you have or have?
I think you can't think about mentors as one person. So that's one. I think ultimately you need to think about learning from people as sort of like, do you have a squad or a network to tap, right? When I have a specific thing that I'm trying to solve for, it's not necessarily just one person that I go to. So the key thing is building that network and building it early. I mean, Sky, if you are interested in women being a product manager, join Women in Product, right? Like start building that early. And I think that's really what's going to help you, because nowadays I think about it more as a tribe or as a squad that I can go to if I have a problem.
I definitely will. So thank you. And I want to be mindful of your time, so we will wrap up. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for everyone for tuning in from both SVS and USWIB. We will see you guys next week, and you can hear more and follow Andrea on Twitter. What's your handle, Andrea Chesleigh?
Oh, it's Andrea Chesleigh. Yeah, it's super, super simple. Andrea Chesleigh. And thanks for having me. I hope you guys found this super helpful. I enjoy really just talking about product. So this was really wonderful. And I hope to hear from you guys again.
Yes, thank you. And I'll be around if there are any final questions. And Andrea, if you have a few more minutes, if there are any
no, happy.
questions.
So you guys do this weekly?
Yeah, so SVS has weekly meetings every Tuesday from 12:30 to 1:30, 1:45. And we have different people